How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Ches, Daf 98 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, Givaldige Daf. We wrap up our discussion on the sizes of an amah. Yesterday, we talked all about the 5 tefach amah, the 6 tefach amah. We are going to wrap up that discussion. Very interesting, in my opinion. We will then discuss how much bread was on each stack of the shulchan. Okay. And the direction and locations of the temple vessels. Not a particularly difficult daf. My guess is it's actually going to be in the 30-40 minute range, which is nice. A little bit shorter than the recent daf. So that's my guess. I haven't recorded it yet, so I don't know. But you'll just look at how long the share is. Friends, let's jump in and study Daf Ches of Masechta Menachos together. Friends, we begin on Daf Ches, Amid Aleph of Masechta Menachos, 2, 4, 6, 7 lines, I believe, if I counted correctly, into the Amid. V'chama amah beinonis. How much is an amah beinonit? We saw on Daf Zayin Amid Aleph, 2, 4, 6 lines from the bottom. We said Tanan Hasam. I'm quoting now from Daf Zayin. That we learned in the Mishnah in Kalim. Rav Meir Omer kol amas shoy b'mikdash beinonios. Rav Meir says that all of the amahs that were used in the Beis HaMikdash were medium-sized amahs. The only exceptions were according to Rav Meir, the golden altar and the Yesod, Sovev, and Karen of the Kranos of the outer altar. Those are the only exceptions. Those use the 5 tefach amah. Everything else were amah beinonis. So the question is, how much is an amah beinonis? So Rabbi Yochanan says that the mid-sized amah is the 6 tefach amah. Rabbi Yossi bar Oven says that we also learn this, that the mid-sized amah is the 6 tefach amah from our Mishnah. Rabbi Meir Omer says, Rabbi Meir, Ashulchan Arko Shnei Masar, V'rachbo Shisha. That the shulchan had a length of 12 tefachim and a width of 6 tefachim. Now, the Torah says that the shulchan was 2 amos long and 1 amah wide. Reb Meir says that the shulchan was 12 tefachim long and 6 tefachim wide. So clearly, 12 tefachim is the equivalent of 2 amos. 1 tefach, 6 tefachim is the equivalent of 1 tefach. 12 tefachim is the equivalent of 2 amos. 6 tefachim is the equivalent of 1 amah. So therefore, Reb Meir had said that the only exceptions to the amah beinonis thing is the golden altar and certain parts of the outer altar. Everything else, including the shulchan, would have used the amah beinonis. And we also know that essentially, if you do the math, the amah beinonis that was used for the shulchan and everything else, right, everything that was not with the smaller tefach, so the beinonis is a 6 tefach amah. Okay. Okay, well, if we're referring to the 6 tefach amah as the mid-sized amah, and we know that there was a 5 tefach amah, so the 5 tefach amah would be the small one. The 6 tefach amah would be the medium one. What's the large one? In Vatanan, we learned in a Mishnah in Masechta Kelim. We learn in a Mishnah in Masechta Kelim. There were 2 amahs in the Shushan Habira. What's the Shushan Habira? Let's take a look at this slide for a second. The Shushan Habira was in Bayis Sheni, in the second temple. So you could say, I should have made an arrow. It's not too late to make an arrow. If I remember, I'm going to make an arrow. Just in case I don't remember. So, the Shushan Habira was the eastern, so it's interesting. As you can see here, so you see there that there's the outer wall of the Beis HaMikdash, there's like a ramp going up to a gate. This is just in case I forget to put in the arrow. I have to describe it as well as I can. So on the outer wall of the temple, wait 1 second. I'm just gonna friggin' quickly throw in an arrow right now. Oh no, I don't even have them. Okay, no, I'm not going to quickly do that. Okay, there is, in the outer wall there is that door. That was what door was that? I think that was maybe just called the Shar Shushan, maybe the Shushan gate. So the eastern gate to Har HaBayis, I think it was actually called the Shar Shushan. The Shar Shushan. Now, above, so first of all, what's interesting about that is that Rashi here, and also the Bar Tenura on this Mishnah, described that the Shar Shushan was a gate going into the Azara. However, the Mishnah in Midos, which I just learned recently, actually says that it's a gate to Har HaBayis. Right, Har HaBayis being, you see, the Beis HaMikdash was really the Azaras, right? When we talk about the Beis HaMikdash, we're talking about the Azara, and right, if you think about the Mishkan in the wilderness, you walk right in and you're in the Azara. Just that in the Beis HaMikdash, so Har HaBayis was surrounded with a wall. Right? Basically, the mountain, right, the Mount Moriah was surrounded with a wall, but the big outer wall of the Beis HaMikdash was not the Beis HaMikdash. That was Har HaBayis, the Temple Mount. Within the Har HaBayis complex, within the Har HaBayis, there was the Beis HaMikdash. There was the Azara, there was the Ulam, the Kodesh Kodashim, etc. Now, so the Mishnah in Masechta Midos says, and as is shown in this photo, that the eastern entrance to Har HaBayis was called the Shar Shushan. Why was it called the Shar Shushan? Because you can't see in this photo, but even if you can, I don't know how anybody would know that this is literally what it looked like. But the point is that above the gate, there was actually an illustration, as we're going to see soon, of Shushan Abira. It was King Daryavesh. Was it Daryavesh? I think it was Daryavesh, right? Or was it Koresh? I feel like maybe it was Koresh. I think it was probably Koresh. That, correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was Koresh. He said that right, he allowed the Yidden to come back and build the second temple, and on this gate, the Shar Shushan would be some kind of illustration of the city Shushan of Purim fame. Okay, so now above the Shar Shushan there was an office, which it doesn't in this photo. I don't really see an office, but above there was like a room above Shar Shushan. Now in that room, so remember this was the eastern wall of the Temple Mount. So in that room, now again, Rashi and also the Bar Tenura say that it was actually an entrance to the Azara. So I don't know if anybody has any insight there, please share with us. So above this gate was some kind of a room. And in that room, there were two rulers, I'll call them, measuring sticks. Two amah measuring sticks. So now, back to our Mishnah from Masechta Kelim. So what's now? We learn in Mishnah Masechta Kelim. Shtei amah soyu b'Shushan Abira. So in the office that was above the Shushan gate, so in that room there were two measuring sticks, two amahs. Achas akeren mizrachis tzvonis, v'achas akeren mizrachis dromis. That's one in the right corner, one in the left corner. Let's call it right, the northeastern, the northwestern. Okay. She'al keren mizrachis tzvonis, on the northeastern corners, that would have been the the northeastern corners, that would have been, I don't know, depending which you put, whatever, in one of the corners. So Yisera al shel Moshe chatzi etzba val she'al keren mizrachis dromis aisu Yisera al lea chatzi etzba nimtzeis Yisera al shel Moshe etzba. Okay, it's very technical, but it's not hard. So basically, the standard amah was 6 tefachim. Now, what was the larger? Right, we said the 6 tefach amah was the intermediate, was the mid-sized amah. So what was the larger amah? The smaller one was 5 tefachim. The medium one is 6 tefachim. What's the larger one? So there were actually two larger ones. They were ever so slightly larger than the regular amah. So the regular amah is 6 tefachim. Each tefach, if I'm not mistaken, is 4 finger breadths. So in amah, that 6 tefachim is be'etzem 24 finger breadths. Now, one of those measuring sticks was essentially 24 finger breadths and a half a finger, 24 and a half finger breadths. So it was bigger than the regular amah by a 24th. The other one was a whole finger breadth more. So it was 25 finger breadths. So 124. Wait, so what did I say? So the smaller of the larger ones was a half one. So that was 1/48 larger than the regular amah, and then the one that was 1 finger breadth larger was 1/24th larger. So basically it was ever so slightly larger than the regular amah. The question is why? We'll explain why in a second. Okay. So there was the shushan abira. In the shushan abira, there were these two measuring sticks. They were both slightly larger. Right? One was ever so slightly larger than the 6 tefach amah, and the other one was ever so slightly larger than that one. Now, V'lama amru achas gedol v'achas ketana. Why did they need these? Why did they need these? And the answer is kadeshu umanin notlin biktana umachzirin bigdola kadesh leyavo lidei meila. Very interesting. The reason for these ever so slightly larger rulers, and we'll explain what the purpose of the slightly larger one and what the purpose of the slightly larger than that one was. We'll get there in a second. But Bichlal, why was there this concept of these rulers that were ever so slightly larger than a regular amah? The answer is because we're concerned about me'ila. That if you have somebody who builds walls, and the bedek habayis, the temple maintenance, needed people who could fix and build walls. So if you have a builder, a local builder, and he's contracted to build 10 amas worth of wall, and he's going to be paid, I don't know, $100 per amma, so $1,000 for 10 amas worth of wall. So he's concerned that, well, what if he builds 9.999 amas worth of wall, but he's accepting payment of $1,000 for 10 amas worth of wall? I mean, he's getting overpaid, even if it's ever so slightly. But he doesn't want to get overpaid. He doesn't want to deal with me'ila, with getting benefit from hektish, from these temple funds, without providing the correct amount of value in return. So therefore, in order to kind of be safe and make sure that you're providing at least the value that you're promising and that you're being paid for, so he would say, I'm going to build 10 amas worth of wall, but the fact of the matter is, each amah he would use a measuring stick that was slightly larger than an amah, and that way he's being contracted for 10 amas, so it'll be 10 amas and an extra 24 finger breaths, which would essentially be essentially 11 amas, I guess. Did I get that correct? No, 11. It would be, wait, what? It would be 11. No, it would be an extra. Let's assume that it would be it would be an extra finger breath for each amma. So it would be an extra 10 finger breaths, which would be about a tefach and a half, a tefach and 2/3. So it would be 10 ammas and an extra tefach and 2/3. So the point of the larger amma was to make sure, basically the contract would be for 10 regular ammas worth of wall, but the builder would build these, slightly more than 10 amas worth of wall, and that way he knows that the $1,000 that he's being paid for 10 amas worth of wall, he's definitely providing at least that amount. Now, Tosfos points out that this technically shouldn't actually be really me'ila, because when it comes to hektish, you could technically be poded on any amount, right? So if you have $100 with hektish, so you should be poded for $100. But even if you were mechalet with like a penny or whatever, technically it works. So therefore, as long as he's providing any amount of value, technically it really shouldn't be me'ila. But still, he doesn't want to the builder doesn't, he doesn't want to mess with that. He doesn't want to play with fire. Therefore, if he says he's going to provide 10 amas worth of value, he wants to make sure he's providing at least 10 amas worth of value, and therefore he uses this measure that's ever so slightly larger. Okay, fine. So that answers why conceptually there was this amah there was this amah measuring stick that was ever so slightly larger than an amah. It does not answer why one was half an etzba more and the other was a full etzba more. So the answer is chada lekaspa v'dava v'chada lebinyana. Well, it depends what the contract was for. If it was to build something of gold and silver, which is an expensive metal, so the smaller amma would use that. If you were contracted to build something that was going to be made, I don't know, it was going to be made out of silver or something or gold, and it was contracted for one amma, so you'd use one amma and half a finger breadth more, because we want to make sure it's more, but also we recognize it's expensive. But so just ever so slightly more. But if it was going to be like building the wall, for example, so then you would use the amah that is a full finger breadth larger than an amah. You can drink a little tea with honey. Okay. Now says the Gemara, Tnan Hasan, we learn in the Mishnah in Masechta Midot. Shara Mizrach, Olav Shushan Abira, that the eastern gate, right, that the Mishnah in Masechta Midot says that there were 5 gates to Har Habayis. The eastern one was called Shar, was the gate that Olav Shushan Abira, that had a tzura, had a drawing of Shushan Habira on it. My time, how come? Seems a little random. How come there was a gate going into the Temple Mount that had an illustration of the capital city of Shushan of Persia? Rav Chizda Omar, does Rashi? Does Rashi? Yeah. Okay. Fine. Okay. Anyways, so my time Rav Chizda Rav Yisrael Rav Dimi Machlokes Rav Chizda Rav Yisrael Rav Dimi Chad Omar Kedei Sheyedu Meichan Ba'u. One is so that they should know where they came from, but Rashi says Kilu. I think it's Rashi says that Kilu, how far they've come. Right? Rav Yir Meichan Ba'u v'yitnu hodah lemalkom shotziam misham. Right? That they should know where they came from. I was having another, as I was just reading that Rashi over, right, Malcolm is the king of Persia. So basically that was so that they should see where they came from and give thanks to the king of Persia. Very interesting. The other opinion is Emas Malchus Alein. So they should always remember that they are still subjects of the king of Persia and not to rebel. So it was a little reminder about that they came from Persia, and it was important for us to remember that, interestingly, when going into the Beis Hamikdash. So that though that was not a primary entrance to Har Habayis, I think the primary entrances were in the south and in the west, but okay, this existed, interestingly. Okay. Rabbi says one should always have the fear of the king upon him. Even just a regular king of flesh and blood. Shenemar, as Moshe Rabbeinu says to Paro, "V'yardu kol avadecha ele elai v'shtachvu li," and all of your servants are going to be coming, running to me and bowing down to me. Lemor v'ilu lididei lo kamer. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't say you're going to come running and bowing down to me, even though that's what happened, but he gave proper respect to Paro, and he said, it's your subjects who are going to be running to me. As the Pasuk says, that after the whole showdown between Elijah the prophet and the servants of Baal, where they made they each made altars on Mount Carmel, and it was Elijah's altar that the sacrifice was burnt on. And it says that after that, Achav went to Jezreel Valley. Our friend Dennis has a special relationship with Jezreel Valley. And it says that Achav went down to Jezreel Valley to see his wife, Queen Jezebel, there, and they were going to eat and drink there. And because Achav, even though he was a Madna guy, he was the king, and Elijah, a prophet, went and he ran in front of Achav all the way to Jezreel out of honor for the king, even though Achav wanted to kill him. Nonetheless, he still gave proper honor to Achav, meaning Achav wanted to kill him. Now, apparently, he wasn't going to kill him after the whole showdown at Mount Carmel, although Queen Jezebel felt different. differently, and he had to hide. Al Kopanim, so we see that Elijah, the prophet, nonetheless gave honor to King Achav. Friends, now we discuss how much bread was on each stack of the shulchan. Wait, where are we? Okay, fine. Well, we'll get there in about a second. Valeu l'sufa. Wait, first one little tiny anecdote, and then we'll get to the bread on the stacks in the shulchan. Valeu l'sufa. So the psukim in Sefer Yechezkel describe that in the third temple, there will be a stream that will go out from the Holy of Holies, from the Kodesh HaKodashim, and that stream, on either side, on the banks of that stream, are going to grow the most gishmaka fruits. If you think that the fruits in Eretz Yisrael are something else, which they are, imagine the fruits that are going to grow on the banks of this stream. I can only imagine Shabbos is going to be unbelievable with those fruits. Looking forward. And the leaves of those trees are going to be medicinal. And says the pasuk, Valeu l'srufa, its leaves will be for tinctures, for will have medicinal properties. Rav Chizda, Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi, Chad Omer lahatir peh shelemayla, v'chad Omer lahatir peh shelemata. One opinion that it is to open the mouth, the upper mouth, and the other is that it's to open the lower mouth. Itmar, Chizkiah, Omer says Chizkiah, what does that mean, the upper mouth, the lower mouth? Lahatir peh ilmim. Well, if you have a mute person who is unable to talk, well, those leaves, maybe drinking a tea or something with those leaves, will allow this person who was unable to talk to talk. Bar Kapara Omer lahatir peh akaros. And Bar Kapara says that the lower mouth means that if there was a woman who was struggling to have children, her womb would open and have children. That is the medicinal properties of these leaves. Now, Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Ilu nemar v'lakachta soles v'afisa osa shtei mesrei chalos. So we have two psukim now. The first psukim talks about how on the shulchan there are going to be 12 loaves. V'samta osam shtayim ma'arachos, on 2 stacks. V'lo nemar, where am I? Okay, fine. V'lo nemar sheish, meaning the point is that there are 2 psukim. They are in, is that in Parshas Truma or is in, let's see. Oh, Vayikra. No, it's not. It's in Parshas Emor, which is going to be next week's Parsha. But we have 2 psukim there. The first pasuk says that there are 12 showbreads. The second pasuk says, and those 12 showbreads are going to be organized into 2 stacks with 6 breads on each stack. So there are basically 3 key numbers there. The 12 breads, the 2 stacks, the 6 breads on each. The Gemara is going to describe why we need all 3 of those, why we couldn't, for example, say just 2 stacks with 6 breads. Okay, doesn't that mean that there are 12 of them? So let's see. So if it didn't say the 6, if it just said 12 breads and 2 stacks, I could have said 1 stack of 4 and 1 stack of 8. Okay, that's why we needed 6 to say no. Each stack has 6. So this is the most interesting one, most interesting play over here. If it just said 2 stacks, 6 breads, so honestly, sounds like, okay, 2 stacks of 6 breads, right? So 12. So you don't need to say 12. Well, I could get creative here. I could think that it's saying 2 stacks plus 6 more, i.e., there were 3 stacks and each one had 6, right? There were 2 stacks also plus a stack of 6, i.e., to add on to the existing 2 stacks of 6. So if it didn't say 12, shalosh, 3 stacks, shel shesh with 6 on each stack for a total of 18. Therefore it says 12 showbreads, not 18. If it just said 12 showbreads on 2 stacks, if you just said 12 chalos uma arachos and they'll be stacked, but it doesn't say v'lo nemer shtemes shtayim v'sheish, but it doesn't say how many stacks. It doesn't say 2 stacks, and it doesn't say that there are 6 per stack. I could say, well, let's divide the 12 showbreads into 3 stacks of 4. Right, 3 stacks with 4 each. Therefore, it also says 2 stacks, 6 breads each. And therefore, unless we have all 3 of these elements, the 12 breads, the 2 stacks, the 6 breads per stack, lo lamadnu, we would not have all of the information that we need. Haketzad, so what do? Nosen shtayim marachos, 2 stacks, shel sheish, with 6 breads on each of the 2 stacks. V'im nosen achas shel arba v'achas shel shmona, if there was 1 stack of 4 and another stack of 8, lo yotza, no good, not yotze. Shtayim shel sheva sheva, and if there were 2 stacks of 7 breads each, Rebbe Omer roinas elyona kilu ena. So Rebbe says, interestingly, well, that is actually okay, because you have a stack of 6, and each one has an extra one. Okay, we could just ignore the extra one. What about the fact that the pasuk says that the frankincense, the baziche levona, go on top of the stack, i.e., it needs to be on top of the actual stack, not on top of an extra bread that's on top of the stack. No, it needs to be on the stack, not on something that's on top of the stack. Right? If you have 7, we're saying, well, we'll just view the extra bread like just on top of, right? We have the 6 breads that we care about, and then there's just an extra one on top. The problem is that the ladle with the frankincense is going to be resting not on the stack, but on the thing that's on top of the stack. So Omar le Rav Chizda le Rav Nuna va'amr le Rav Nuna le Rav Chizda Rebbe le Talmud Omar, that, well, Rebbe's opinion is al b'samach, like we saw the other day in the Mishnah, that al, in this case, means next to the stack. So the frankincense was not on top of each of the stacks, but they were in between, right? Like we saw according to Reb Meir, that the length of the shulchan was 12 tfachim, whereas each stack was 5 tfachim wide, so times 2 is 10. There was an extra 2 tfachim, and that 2 tfachim was in between the stacks, and Abba Shaul had said that the frankincense would be put there, directly on the table between the stacks. Tisani is willing to brisa. Rabbi Yomi says, Rabbi Benasata al hamareches levona zaka, that the levona will be al hamareches al b'samach. And Rabbi says it means next to the stacks. Atomer al b'samach eno ela al mamish. Wait, how do you know that al means next to the stacks? Maybe it means literally on the stacks. Kishomer v'sakosa ala orin es aparoiches haveomer al b'samach. That when the pasuk says, where is this? This is probably at the end. Yeah, this is at the end of Shemos. I don't know, maybe in Vayakel or Pekude. V'samto shamis aron edus. Okay, that you'll put the aron in the Kodesh HaKodashim, and it says that the paroches, v'sakosa al aron is a paroches, and the paroches will cover on top of the aron. What does it mean? You don't put the paroches on top. The paroches was a divider between the Kodesh and the Kodashim. It wasn't put on top of the aron. It was put adjacent to the aron, next to the aron. It was hanging from the ceiling to the ground next to the aron as a divider between the Kodesh and the Kodashim. It wasn't on the aron, and yet it says al aron. So we see that on, al could mean next to as well. And now we are going to discuss the direction and locations of the temple vessels, specifically the shulchan, the menorah, and the aron. So, okay, we said that all of the vessels in the temple, their direction was consistent with the direction of the Azara. We will discuss that and see what that looks like. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, all of the vessels in the temple, orkan, their length, the orko shel bias were consistent, were parallel with the length of the Azara. Chutz mi aron, except for the aron. She'orko lirochbo shel bias, that its length was perpendicular to the length of the Azara. Okay, let's just take a look at this slide quickly. So, well, you see in this slide, so first of all, if we look at the little key there at the top right, so the top is north, the bottom is south, the right is east, the left is west. Now, okay, so what do we see there? Those are obviously terrible icons that I made, but I think that they look like what they should look like, which is what's important. So you have the shulchan there, right? It says shulchan batzafon v'menorah badarum. So the shulchan was in the north of the azara, and as you can see, the length of it is consistent with the length of the azara, going east to west, right? The length of the azara goes from east, the length of the azara, also the length of the heichal, whatever. The length of the whole thing over there is going east to west. And the length of the table is also going east to west. You also see the menorah, right? The candles of the menorah. You have also the candle all the way to the right is furthest east, and it makes the candle furthest away is all the way to the west. So the difference is that when you get to the Aron, where you see in the Kodesh HaKodashim, there actually it's perpendicular, right? The length of the Aron is actually going north-south. And you could see, however, that the poles, however, are consistent with the length of the Azara. They are going east-west, okay? So again, the Shulchan is going east-west, the menorah goes east-west, the Aron is perpendicular, it goes north-south, however, its poles do go east-west. So now, okay. Now says the Gemara, "V'kach oya munach, v'kach oyu badav munachin." This is how the Aron was resting, and this is how its poles were resting. My comment, what does it mean? This is what it means. Kach oya munach, the Aron was placed this way, going north-south, perpendicular. Mid debadav kach oyu munachim, from the fact that the poles were consistent, from the fact that the poles were going east-west, well, that therefore necessitated that if the poles were going east-west, well, then the Aron would be going, the length of the Aron would be north-south, because the poles were kind of connected to the width of the, whatever. Basically, the way that we saw it in the slide, that the poles were where they're meant to be, and therefore the poles are going east-west, and that being the case, the architecture of the Aron was such that the Aron, therefore, the length would have been going north-south. How do we know that the poles were in fact going east-west? The sign is within the Brisa of Vayirichu Abadim. This is a pasuk in Melachim that says that there were the poles of the Aron. Yachol lo ayu nogin biparochis. Is it possible that the poles of the Aron that were used to carry the Aron did not actually touch the parochis that divided between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodashim? Talmud Lomar, therefore the pasuk says vayirau, that they were visible. Ivayirau yachol yehu mikarin biparochis viyotzin. If they were visible, does it mean that they tore a hole through the parochis and were sticking out into the Kodesh? No, they weren't visible. Were they visible? Weren't they visible? Okay, it's that's how so. Dochakin uvoltin beparochis. Well, they were pushing against the parochis. They didn't break through the parochis, but they pushed against the parochis, and they were protruding from the parochis, from behind the curtain. Vidomin kimin shnei dadeisha, and they were similar, like to two breasts of a woman protruding from the parochis. Shenemar tzror amor dodili ben shada yolin. Not exactly sure what the connection there is necessarily to the Beis Hamikdash, but it says, okay, like a bundle of more, my beloved to me, ben shada yolin, will rest between my breasts. So minalan the badav lepusyo the Aron havu yasve. How do we know that this was in fact the case? That the poles of the Aron, that between the poles of the Aron was the length of the Aron, right? That right. The Aron was, I believe, 2.5 amos. Yeah, the Aron was 2.5 amos by 1.5 amos. So how do we know that it was the 2.5 amos that was between the poles of the Aron? Dilma the arko the Aron avu yasve. Maybe in between the poles was 1.5 amos. And if that was the case, then that would mean that the length of the Aron would also be consistent with the east-west direction. Rav Yehuda says, Rav Yehuda, Tregavre be'amsa ufalga lo mistage lehu. The thing is, two people would be unable to fit and walk between just 1.5 amas. Uminalu di ba'arba'a avu daru. And how do we know darulu? How do we know that it was 4 people that would carry the aron? Dichsiv v'nasu akihasim, tray 2. Nosei amikdash, namitre, another 2. Basically, when they would carry the aron, when it had to be moved, at least certainly in the wilderness, I imagine once it was placed in the Beis Hamikdash, I don't think that it left. But anyways, so however, when the aron was being moved, so it would take 4 Levites to hold it, and 2.5 amas would have been enough for 2 people to sit, right? Because you would have 2 people on either side of it, holding it by the poles. So 2.5 amas was enough for 2 people to fit there and hold the aron. 1.5 amos would not have been sufficient. Okay, fine. That is the dilio with the aron. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis thought, Asara shulchanos, also Shloima Melech made 10 shulchans. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Vayas shulchanos Asara, that the pasuk says, where is this? In Divrei Yom, that King Solomon made 10 shulchans. Vayanach be'echal, and he put the 10 shulchans in the heichal. Chamisha miyamin v'chamisha mismail, 5 to the right and 5 to the left. That when you walked into the heichal, so let's take a look at this diagram again. So if you're walking into the heichal from the right, from the east, so the shulchan was to the right. Now we're saying that there were 10 shulchans, 5 to the right and 5 to the left. Now, if it means that 5 of the tables were to the right of the entrance where you walked in, and 5 were to the left of the entrance where you walked in, i.e., 5 were in the north of the Azara, of the Heichel, and 5 were in the south of the Heichel, well, then we're saying that 5 of the tables were in the south, but the Torah specifically says the shulchan is on the right, is on the north. Rather, all 10 of them were on the north, in the north of the Heichel. All 10 of them were to the right of the entrance of the Heichel. What it means is that there still was the shulchan from Moshe Rabbeinu. The shulchan from Moshe Rabbeinu was, again, all of this was in the north of the Azara, but within the north of the Azara, you had the shulchan of Moshe in the middle, and on its right was 5 shulchans, and on its left was another 5 shulchans, but again, all of them were still in the north half of the Azar. We're going to see something very similar now with the menorahs, but in the south of the Azar. Tana Rabbanan, the Rabbi thought, es menorahs, also Shloima. Shloima made 10 menorahs. By Shenemar, as the apostle says, Vayaz es amenoris azov eser, that King Solomon made 10 golden candelabras. Kamishpat, Vayiten behechol chamish miyamin v'chamish mismal. They were put in the heichal, 5 to the right, 5 to the left. V'im tomer chamish miyamin apesach v'chamish mismal apesach. And if it means, like we said a second ago, that when you walked into the heichal, there were 5 to the right of the entrance and 5 to the left, i.e. 5 to the north and 5 to the south. But then that means that essentially you had 5 menorahs in the north of the Azar. Add the words Al-Tzela Mishkan Teimana to the south. Rather, similar to what we said with the tables, the menorahs, all 10 menorahs were on the southern half of the Heichel, which is what it means, is that there was also the menorah of Moshe Rabbeinu. To the right of that menorah was 5 more menorahs, and to its left was 5 more menorahs, but all of these menorahs were in the southern half of the Heichel. Tonichada me chatzi bayis v'lifnim ayu munachin. One Brisa says that all of these, all of these tables, all these menorahs, that the shulchan and the menorah were on the inner half of the Heichel. V'tani chada mishlish habayis v'lifnim ayu munachin, that they were a third into the Heichel. V'lokasha, it's no problem. Ma mar kachoshev beis kachei hakachim Ba'de Heichel, Umar Lo, they agree. They're saying the same thing. It just depends if you include the Kodesh HaKodashim in the Cheshbon. Let's take a look at the slide for a minute to see what this means. If you look at the Heichel and you look at the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Heichel is twice the size of the Kodesh HaKodashim. Therefore, if you are excluding the Kodesh HaKodashim, well then the shulchan and the menorah are in the second half of the Heichel. Then when you walk into the Heichel, the first half did not have these things, and the second half is where the shulchan and the menorah was. If you take into account the Kodesh HaKodashim, so if you walk into the Heichel plus Kodesh HaKodashim, a third, that is one after a third, that is where you will find the table and the menorah in the second third of the 3/3 when you include the Kodesh HaKodashim. Friends, we are going to hold it here for Daf Tzadiches, Daf 98 of Masechta Menachos. On Daf 98 of Masechta Menachos, we wrapped up the discussion on the sizes of an amah. So to conclude that there was the 5. There's basically considered a small, medium, and large amah. The small amah is the 5 tefach amah. The medium amah, which is the standard amah, is the 6 tefach amah. And then there was really 2 amahs that were ever so slightly larger than the standard 6 tefach amah. And the reason why we had those was so that when a contractor was contracted to do work for the Beis Hamikdash, they would make the proposal, and they would agree on a fee and value to be exchanged for that fee, the amount of work to be done for the fee, based on a normal 6 tefach amah. However, what the actual value that he would provide and what he would actually build would be based on an amah that was ever so slightly larger, to make sure that he was providing at least the value that he committed to. One was half an etzbah larger, the other was a full etzbah larger. The one that was only half an etzbah larger was for gold and silver, since those are inherently more expensive items and materials. And the one that was a full etzbah larger was for kind of building walls and kind of more building material oriented things. Okay, now, how much bread was on each stack of the shulchan? Well, there were a total of 12 showbreads and 2 stacks, 6 breads on each stack. And then we discussed the direction and locations of the temple vessels. We discussed that, as a rule, the vessels were parallel to the direction of the Azara and the Heichal, which was east-west. The exception was the Aron, which was north-south, because its poles were east-west. And basically, if the poles were east-west, as we learned from the Psukim, then Mimele, the Aron was north-south, because its length was between the 2 poles, so that there would be enough space for the carriers to stand there. We discussed that the shulchan is in the north of the Eichel, the menorah is in the south of the Eichel, and they are both essentially in the second half of the Heichel when the Kodesh HaKodashim is excluded. When the Kodesh HaKodashim is included, well then it is once you've walked in a third to the 3 sections of the 3 sections. Friends, that was Daf Tzadiches, Daf 98 of Masechta Menachos. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy your day. Have a great day. Cheers. Bye.